Hello and welcome to the Reach for the Sky podcast. Hello and welcome, and if you've listened to the first episode, welcome back. I hope those who have listened to the Ernst Bachmann episode, you enjoyed that little historical feature. For those of you that haven't, the first episode is just under 20 minutes long. It includes an introduction of myself, my gaming interests, and a 15-minute feature on Panzer Ace Ernst Bachmann. So if you're interested in that, I can recommend checking out the first episode. So today, I'm focusing on a trip I made recently to Booker Airfield, and more specifically, Personal Planes Services Limited, run by Tony Bianchi, with assistance from his wife. Personal Plane Services is a company that specialises in restorations and actual work on customers' aircraft, so things like applying paintwork, vinyl coverings, restoring and repairing aircraft, and I had a look in their hangar. My father is a long-time friend of Tony Bianchi. He's known him for about 40 years. So we popped in and had a look around, and I got some great pictures. Those pictures will be available on my blog, and I'll also be putting them in the background of the YouTube upload of my episode of this show, episode 2. So I saw some great things in there. He didn't have a lot going on at that specific time. I suppose it's just the time of year, I guess. But there was still some very interesting things in there. There was something very special. There was a 2-seat Spitfire Mark 9 trainer. Now, why was this so special? Well, it was the original Supermarine prototype for the trainer model. It wasn't converted from a single-seater. It was specifically built as a 2-seater, so in that sense there's only one in the world. It's not the only 2-seat trainer of a Spitfire Mark 9, but it's the original scratch-built 2-seater, so that was quite a privilege to see. There was also a couple of Russian planes. I believe they were both Yak-11 trainers. I can't say if they had a combat record, or because they were used in combat in the Korean and Vietnam wars, but I imagine these didn't see service because they look quite recent in the sense that they'd been thoroughly looked after. They were under restoration, and they were in very good condition. One of them had a nice little Order of the Soviet Union decal on the engine cowling. There was a couple other little biplanes. There was an orange biplane. I'm afraid I didn't know the model of it, but it did have a Swiss flag painted onto the rudder. That was cool. And one of the radial engines was actually removed from the LA-11, and it was up on the table. That was incredible. Seeing an actual radial engine exposed, a huge thing. And obviously there are radial engines much bigger than that, because this is only a trainer aircraft developing a few hundred horsepower, but even that, it was I think it was a 12-cylinder, maybe a 14-cylinder, but that was great. And in the back he had a few small projects going on. And there was also a couple of his employees were working on a plane, applying a sort of hexagon honeycomb pattern onto a customer's aircraft. So that was interesting. Booker Airfield itself is in southeast England, in Berkshire, if I remember correctly. It might just be over the border of Berkshire into one of the neighbouring counties, but it's in the southeast. It's a fairly small airfield. It's privately owned and ran, and it's open to the public, where you can store your light aircraft, and they also offer training. I believe there's a club there, and there's also training services, so you can go there to get your pilot's license or helicopter license. Actually, when we were there happened to be someone training as a helicopter pilot out in the field, hovering around and doing basic manoeuvres. That was quite interesting. Not the biggest airfield by any means, but it's still pretty interesting. So it makes a nice little day out if you've got a bit of free time. And about 2 weeks ago, I also visited the RAF Museum at Hendon in North London, which is a thoroughly interesting place. I can very highly recommend it. There are so many planes there. Many of them original Saw combat. They have all sorts there. There are Spitfires, there's an ME-109, Focke-Wulf, big 4-engine bombers like the B-17, 24, Lancaster. There's Gloucester Meteors. There's a whole area specifically for helicopters. There's an English Electric Lightning. Some very old flying boats, sort of circa 1920, I think they were, 1930. Fantastic stuff. You can't, I don't believe you can touch them, but the fencing that surrounds the plane gets in very close, so you can literally get in right next to them. Although I did actually, I touched the tail wheel of a P-51, so I can technically say, although I've touched a P-51, but there is a video on my YouTube channel of a few photos and a bit of commentary as well in the background of the photos. So if you're interested, check that out. Once again, my YouTube channel is the same name as my podcast, Reach for the Sky, except there's no spaces. Now, a bit of news from the developer blog. The F7F Tigercat has been officially announced with images, and it will, I believe, it's coming in 1.43, if not 1.45. And it's a American 2-engined naval fighter, which also had the capability of carrying bombs or a single torpedo on certain models. The F7F Tigercat first flew in November 1943, and it was initially accepted into service with the US Navy in 1944. It was retired a decade later in 1954. As well as the Navy, the US Marine Corps also used it. The variant that's going to be featured in War Thunder is the initial production variant, the F7F1. This was a fighter bomber, armed with 4 20mm cannons, just inbound of the engines, just in the wing roots, so like where the MG151s are on the Focke-Wulf 190, and 4 50 cals in the nose. It was powered by a pair of Pratt & Whitney R2822Ws, which are pretty similar to the engine the Bearcat uses. I suppose it's comparable in size and shape to a cross between a Beaufighter and a P-38, really. Except it's very slender. The fuselage is very narrow. The tail is huge. The wings are pretty big, and the engines are huge as well for the size of the plane. So it's going to be a very fast plane. The turning will probably be quite good. Not as good as something like a Spitfire, say, but pretty decent. The F7F Tigercat actually began as a development of a plane that's already in War Thunder, the XP-50. The XP-50 continued to be developed and improved and turned into the XP-55. But in 1943, work on this was terminated in favour of the design which would eventually become the F7F. Grumman wanted a fighter that outperformed and outgunned existing fighters, but they also wanted it to have a secondary ground attack capability. The armament was very heavy, as I mentioned, 4 cannon and 4 50 cals. And there were provisions for bombs and torpedoes beneath the fuselage and the wings. Initially, the F7F passed its early trials with flying colours. It had one of the highest performing engines fitted on a piston-powered aircraft, and in fact it was one of the fastest propeller-driven aircraft that saw service. The top speed was well in excess of any single-engine fighters of the time, and it was 71 miles per hour faster than the Hellcat at sea level. One of the Navy's most well-known test pilots, Fred M. Trapnell, said, I quote, "It's the best damn fighter I've ever flown," unquote. The F7F was originally named the Tomcat, but people thought this was a bit too suggestive in the 40s. They thought that was a bit risque. But funnily enough, that obviously became known as the name for the F-14 Tomcat. But eventually, obviously, they went for the name Tigercat. The size of the aircraft and its engines obviously made it rather heavy. This meant that the landing speed was quite high. To prevent stalling, speed had to be kept up higher than a single-engine aircraft. But the main problem with allowing the Tigercat to operate on carriers was the lack of directional stability with only one engine running, as well as problems with the arrestor hook in the tail of the aircraft. So if the aircraft was forced to land with a single engine, the plane performed very badly in the horizontal plane. The initial production series was only used by the USMC from land bases, mostly as night fighters. But eventually the F7F3 corrected the initial issues caused with taking off and landing on a carrier. There were still a few problems though. Heavy landing could make the undercarriage collapse. So there were still a few problems, but it was going in the right direction. So seeing as we're going to be getting the F7F1, I imagine that we're going to be having takeoffs from land-based positions, runways, or maybe even an air start, which could be which could rile a few Japanese players, because as you know, most Japanese realistic battles and simulated battles take place over the ocean. So carrier takeoffs or air takeoffs for planes that aren't land-based, carrier-based. Sorry, so may be having some air starts for it, which could be a bit problematic. The F7F had a fairly limited operational history, once again, because of the fact that the Tigercat was introduced at the dawn of the jet age, much like the Bearcat, so they were doomed to become obsolete within a very short time. But they did see some action. They saw action in the Korean War and shot down 2 Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes, which is quite funny because that was one of the slowest planes in the world by the 1950s. But, that was in fact the only combat mission, the only combat action that the Tigercat took part in, the only time it shot down planes in anger. But as time went on and the Tigercat was removed from frontline service because of its obsolescence, most of the remaining F7S were turned into drones for combat training. In 1945, 2 Tigercats were evaluated by the British Royal Navy, but these were rejected in favour of the de Havilland Hornet, which was essentially the successor to the Mosquito. It was basically a Mosquito powered by larger engines, so Rolls-Royce Merlin 130s or 131s, which had 2,000 horsepower each. That was a very fast plane, and personally I'd like to see it in game because it looks like a very capable aircraft. So that's a bit of background on the Tigercat, which should be hitting All Thunder very soon. Thanks for listening, guys, and see you in the 3rd episode.